Prohibition was certainly an interesting time, which elicited a lot of fascinating responses in Jewish life, including rabbinic responses. But not all of them were the same, and that is something we're going to delve into Reform rabbinic response to Prohibition in this episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Rabbi Zach Goodman. Rabbi Zach, Rabbi Goodman, how do you prefer?
Either way is all good.
Great. So we're going to be talking about reform responses to Prohibition, and longtime listeners and viewers of the show may remember we've done a Prohibition episode. We've also done specifically last year, we did an episode about a very specific and particular Orthodox response to Prohibition, but now I'm very excited to welcome Rabbi Zach to discuss reform responses to Prohibition. So, but before we get into it,
sure,
Rabbi Zach or Rabbi Goodman or both.
Zachary's good.
Rabbi Zachary Zach Goodman, what bio? What can you share with us about yourself?
Sure. So I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and went to HUC, the Hebrew Union College. I'm a Reform rabbi here in Cincinnati.
Go Cincinnati.
And when I was ordained, I did a few years in Toronto at Holy Blossom Temple. I was the assistant rabbi here, and just this summer came to Cincinnati to be the associate rabbi at the Isaac M. Wise Temple. I love a good drink. I love Jewish music. I've got 2 kids, my beautiful wife, and thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Holy Blossom, is that really what it's called?
It's called the Holy Blossom Temple. It's actually incredibly old, and it does sound a bit like a church. That's what everyone always says. It was a wonderful, wonderful congregation there, and
amazing.
Think about it often. Yeah,
amazing. Okay, so as we get into this particular topic, so it's funny because I'm excited what we're going to discuss because I absolutely do not know what we're going to be discussing. Parameters that I already know, sort of broadly speaking, when Prohibition came about. Volstead Act, early 1920s. We have, I think the allowance for alcohol was mainly, it was a Protestant country. It was predominantly Protestants. They're like, oh, who needs alcohol? Oh, Catholics. And they have a whole church hierarchy. They have it as part of their services. They didn't really think about Jews. Now, Jews, we don't have a lot of alcohol, wine used really in our services per se, in synagogues, temples, etc. Really, where we find it is Kiddush, Havdalah, 4 cups of the Passover Seder, more home-based, and that kind of was to some degree anarchic because certainly Orthodoxy does not have a Catholic church hierarchy, and so it was fairly anarchic. But Reform, and certainly anybody who's read Marnie Davis, who was an early guest of the show, her book, Jews and Booze, really tries to position this whole debate, 19th and then into the 20th century, around these matters. It's not exclusively just about alcohol, but it's about fitting within the American framework.
Right. So we have to back up a little bit and talk about the historical context of 1920. What does it look like to be a Jewish person in this country? Mm-hmm. We're dealing with a great deal of anti-Semitism on one hand.
Never goes away.
Unfortunately.
Thank you, Kanye.
Yeah. And they're also dealing with a great deal of assimilation, particularly in the Reform community. And how do we act? What is the public perception of Jews?
Mm-hmm. It's also really interesting looking, really snapshot in time, 1920s. Orthodoxy at that time really didn't care. They didn't really get a lot out of trying to integrate within the broader American sociological context. But obviously the Orthodoxy has changed. It's very complex, and conservatives and Reform were a lot more integrated within that, right?
Yes, I think they're really concerned about public perception, as it has to do with anti-Semitism as well. So they care.
They're not linked. They're connected.
Right, they're connected. Yeah. So the Volstead Act, Article 7, right, of the Volstead Act says you can pull out, a religious leader can pull out wine, and doctors can pull out wine.
Oh, really?
I'm not going to talk about the physicians, but it's
interesting. It's really fascinating because I don't know much about the Volstead Act.
So Article 7 is the piece which is really problematic for the Jews at the time.
Because it does specify religious leaders.
It says...
So it's rabbis.
Right, it's rabbis. Mm-hmm. It's priests, and you already named it. The issue was the Catholic Church, they're drinking for communion. It's
also very hierarchical.
Correct.
Yeah.
They have the Central Conference of American Rabbis is the reform body, right? There's the Rabbinic Assembly is the conservative body, and the Orthodox is the Union of Orthodox, or the Union of...
The main one. There are multiple ones.
Right. That's the big one. The
I was going to say, speaking to the anarchic
right.
Orthodox Rabbinate in America. Okay.
So they look at this, the Reform rabbis, they look at this Article 7, and they say, at best, we are tarnishing the good name of rabbis in our country, because the rabbis are the ones who are signing off this liquor, a lot of which is ending up in speakeasies and racketeering businesses and things. And at worst, it's tarnishing the name of the Jewish people, right? That it's building into that anti-Semitic trope of the Jews as a conniving people. The Jews are manipulating the U.S. government to kind of get what they want. So it's
and there's also been a massive recent influx in the previous three and a half decades of Jews. Like, sure, you have Jews from wherever previous to the 1880s, but in the previous, 3.5, 4 decades, a massive influx from Russia and Poland.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so let's see, it starts in 1920, right? January of 1920.
Right, but you start having all these Jews coming in the late 1880s.
Right. And so they're established, right, already for 40 so years.
Yeah.
Within a year of the Volstead Act in place, the notorious anti-Semite, Henry Ford. So he
here in the Midwest.
Right here, publicly attributes 95% of the nation's bootlegging is Jewish, which is just completely inaccurate, right? It's
sure, but also
it could be true. It could be true, but it's not. It's clearly not.
We're only 65.
No, we're a very small percentage.
Okay.
And remember, it's just wine, right? Because we're only able to pull out it's sacramental wine.
Okay.
So a doctor might be able to pull out whiskey or something to say, this person needs to be sedated, but we're pulling out wine for sacramental purposes, and it's just not 95%. I mean, we're a small percentage, not insignificant, and the Jews and Booze book is a great one and has the right statistics, but
I was going to say, anti-Semites are going to anti-Semite. They're going to do what they're going to do.
So I was interested in
I mean, it's not totally untrue. Look, it's obviously not 95%. At the same time, like, Jews largely don't care about prohibition. We see that even bringing the reform stuff, and especially from Arnie Davis's book. She mentions Rabbi Isaac Wise talking in the 19th century. Like, look to the Jews as the model for you can buy, but not totally inappropriately. Why not use the Jews as a model? Of course, that doesn't win the day over the Protestants.
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
In that 6 years before, let me take a small step back.
Absolutely.
A lot of the information I'm going to talk about today comes from. So how do we analyze what the Reform rabbis are thinking about this at the time? So the CCAR keeps yearbooks. And they're not a lot of fun. They're stored at the American Jewish Archives here
in Cincinnati.
The gem of Cincinnati.
Go Ohio.
And they function mainly as this synopsis of proceedings. So it's a lot of business meeting minutes, it's committee reports, it's sermons, papers, things like that, right? And so what I did is where does the words wine pop up in the yearbooks? Where do the word prohibitions pop up in the yearbooks? And a couple other keywords searches that I did. And there's old dusty books. Go ahead.
Double clicking into this, when and what was the context of your research into this?
Yeah, so I was...
Of course, it would be amazing if you did this just for this episode.
Just for this episode.
That'd be incredible.
No, I was a rabbinic student. I was writing a paper with Rabbi Dr. Zola at the Archives about the American Jewish experience. And so I was interested to know, what was it like to be a Jew during a Prohibition?
Especially, right. It's hard to be a Jew without drinking.
Right.
That's part of the American Jewish experience.
Right. So to your point, it's 1914, 6 years before the Prohibition starts, and the CCR makes this claim, exactly to your good point. The Jewish people have, we want to go on record, you can drink, right?
Yeah.
Ethically, morally speaking, within Judaism, there's nothing wrong with drinking. And secondly, that they go on record to say, and we are in favor of like a tempered habit. We are in favor of these kind of Protestant family moral values that they're teetering the line.
They're playing both sides.
They're playing both sides, right? So they're playing a little safe. And then you fast forward, it's not mentioned again until 1920, and immediately they recognize, okay, this is a problem. This is a problem for the Jews because our name is being tarnished. There's anti-Semitism is picking up because of this. They're even creating fake rabbis who are registering these fake,
O'Malley or Shaughnessy.
Right.
Or
so you've talked about this on other episodes. But all these like insane things, the funneling into speakeasies. It's not good. What do? They say, okay, this is clearly not good. We got to do something. And so the CCAR taps a rabbi by the name of Julius Rappaport. He's
sounds like a Cohen.
He's a posek, so he's writing responsa.
Oh
wow. He asked, they ask him, do you need this to be wine, right? What's the blessing? Borei Peri Hagafen, the fruit of the vine. So why does it need to be fermented wine? Couldn't you just do grape juice? And so Rabbi Rappaport goes out and on the basis of Talmudic text and on the legal codes, everything that he finds shows that fermented wine is not essential and that you can do everything with grape juice. And so that becomes the standard
it's fascinating
of the Reform
because
movement.
It's fascinating. I mean, just briefly, I haven't read what Rabbi Rappaport wrote, but there is very clearly, I think it's Baba Batra 97b or something like that. Rava states you can literally, for Kiddush on Shabbat, you can literally take a thing of grapes, squeeze it into a glass on Friday night, make Kiddush on that, boom, you're good.
You're good. Okay. They were talking about raisin wine. If you've ever had raisin wine.
So I've never had raisin wine, but people can check out episode number 100 of the Jewish Drinking Show featuring Professor Jonathan Sarna talking about the 19th century phenomenon in American Jewish life of raisin wine, especially for the Passover Seder. Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far with Rabbi Goodman. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek featuring Professor Jordan Finken next week on Yiddish drinking terms.
Shikavi Lot, which is, you don't have to know who Lot is to know that Shikavi Lot is
it's an enhanced level.
Really schnockert. Yeah, exactly. So and that's something that you don't want to be.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek with Professor Finken, and back into this episode with Rabbi Goodman.
So the Reform rabbis then say, okay, listen, we know there's a problem. This is affecting all of us. So we got to do something about it. So on top of the response, okay, everyone drink grape juice. Well, the Orthodox community does not accept the response. No, it has to be fermented wine.
That's right.
The Rabbinic Assembly does it. Louis Ginsburg writes this very, and he is considered
an
a
American Jewish Yearbook or something.
It's published in 1922 in the American Jewish Yearbook, and then it's republished in a couple of different places. But it comes out in 1922 is when Louis Ginsburg essentially agrees with everything that's written in the Reform Responsa, but adds an additional layer of what this is like an interesting bar trivia. So we could do the Jewish. So what are the Jewish necessities of wine? What
else do people come to the Jewish Drinking Show aside from Jewish bar trivia? I mean, like, it's really like the main upshot of this.
So you already named a handful of them, right? So that's why we're here. The wedding. There's the Seder.
Oh, for various rituals and
right. So you have
Kiddush, weddings, bris milah, pidyon habet. I mean, there's a lot.
There's a handful of them. Louis Ginsburg, Rabbi Ginsburg, also names the comforting and consoling of the mourners.
Absolutely.
Which is an interesting one we could unpack in its own episode. So what happens is the CCRR creates this system. They say, okay, this is what we need to do. We need to create a national registry. So the reason you probably haven't heard of this is because it doesn't work out for them, and here's why.
They did try it in the 20s, right?
They tried to create this national
1920s, not to be confused with the 2020s.
Yeah, a couple years ago. The idea being, we want to register the rabbi who is signing off and the person and use of the wine that's going to be used. Right. So it's a lot of
human energy.
Yes. And the reason it doesn't work is it requires Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox rabbis to all go in and say, okay, let's do this registry.
In the 1920s.
In the 1920s. And taken
In the
was
1960s, you could maybe have
Maybe.
some sort of interdenominational cooperation, but not
and I think that's part of the problem is interdenominational cooperation. The bigger problem is now the Reform and conservative rabbis have already published responsa that say, and we don't need the wine.
Yeah.
So why make the registry?
You don't need the intoxicant aspect.
Right.
Of it.
So if they have no intention of using the registry, they're saying let's all go in on this registry.
Oh, but the Orthodox don't care.
We're not going to use it, but the Orthodox, Orthodox rabbis, it's like othering. Like clearly you're the ones who are doing this, right? And so they're like, no, it's offensive. It's offensive.
I mean, they were, but
Whether or not they were,
well, they never really were.
they were, but. All the same, it's still an offensive thing to sign off on. So yeah, we'll be on the register. That doesn't happen.
They want to keep the Orthodox in check.
Yeah. They want to keep they want to keep the Orthodox in check, not just because they want to.
They want to be in good graces with the broader American culture,
exactly,
and perception.
Exactly, and that's one of the things we'll see the shift. When we
by the late 1920s.
By the late 1920s, it's so interesting, and we'll get there in a moment because there's this other rabbi who does he like writes these letters and surveys, and he wants to know like what are you talking about in your communities? What are people doing? He's a CCR board member, and we don't know how many letters he sent out, but we know he received 123 responses to these 9 questions.
Who are the respondents? They're
rabbis? Members of the CCAR, so all Reform rabbis. Okay. Rabbi Morris Lazaron, fascinating character. Again, it could be its own episode. But
has anybody else carried out this research?
Not really. Not that I know of.
That's amazing. Okay.
Not that I know. I haven't read it.
I'm very excited for this research.
Sure. So I did my best to read every one of those letters. It's handwriting.
Thank you for your sacrifice.
Yeah, it's an interesting deal. So they essentially say, of the 123 respondents, only 6 are in favor of status quo.
Wow.
So clearly don't like what's going on. And so
the people who are not in favor would prefer what?
Exactly. So they don't really know. So the survey asks, should we repeal the 18th Amendment, which is separate than the Volstead Act? Right? The 18th Amendment is saying you can't imbibe in intoxicating liquors. The Volstead Act then says like, what the hell? What does that mean? And it tries to define it, all these different articles. And the Volstead Act is also, you hear that article that Jews and rabbis specifically can take it out, right? So they said, okay, should we just repeal the 18th Amendment and we can drink again in America? Should we change the Volstead Act? And that was one of the main things that they wanted to do.
They wanted to change the Volstead.
They wanted to change the Volstead Act. So step 1, the CCR says, what is this?
Rabble-rousing rabbis.
1921. They first say, okay, they write the responsa and say, let's create the registry. Registry doesn't take off, so they suggest, okay, let's appeal to Congress to change the Volstead Act.
Wow.
So they write up and drafted official language. They send it to Congress and say, we want you to repeal Article 7 of the Volstead Act. And you can imagine what happens.
Went nowhere fast.
It went nowhere. Completely falls on deaf ears, like all but ignored. They get a letter back from the Treasury Department of
thank you for your letter.
Which says essentially, thank you for your letter. You are both morally and legally entitled to this wine, so we're not changing anything.
Thank you, dog, but no thanks.
Right. And so then the third option, then they say, okay, we can't change Congress's mind, so let's do this like PR stunt essentially. So they write up, here's what we think about all of this, and they post it in all the local papers and send it to all the members of the CCAR. There's thousands of rabbis all over the country, and say, okay, let's post it everywhere.
Not infrequently, people come up to me and say, hey, have you ever tried this? Or have you ever drank that? And oftentimes I'll say, okay, either I have or haven't, and it definitely generates an interesting conversation. But I haven't really figured out what to do with that, where to put that, those suggestions, those advice, those recommendations of drinks or beverages to consume. So I figured, you know what? Why not channel it? Put it here into the Jewish Drinking Show, because maybe other people's suggestions might bring enlightenment and enhancement to your own drinking life. So if you have a drink, a beverage, whether a cocktail, a spirit, a liqueur, as long as it's kosher, please feel free to send a WhatsApp voice note, a video,
you talking about it for a minute, maybe even up to a minute and a half. And feel free to send my way. I'd love to include your suggestions to share with our listeners. Thank you so much. And now back into the show.
Now it's 1926 when Lazarans start sending these letters out. 4 or 5 years later.
This is like massively later.
Yeah, so
it's the back half of the decade. I mean, this is a lot has changed.
A lot's changed.
Because in like 23, 24, 25, there have been various busts and all these different things. There's been a lot of energy devoted to cracking down on this. But by 1926, the energy's changed and shifted.
Yeah. And you can tell in these letters and the responses. Yeah. One of the questions is like, what is your community? Right, you're writing to the head rabbis of all these communities around the country. What are your communities thinking about this? And none of the rabbis that any of the letters I could read. I should tell you, I couldn't do a lot of the handwriting.
Oh, so you literally saw them.
They're all handwritten letters. Wow. 1926, right? Wow. There's no email yet.
And typewritten, maybe.
Yeah, most of them are handwritten letters.
Oh, wow.
And because he literally sent them out like please send this back to me. Here it was a typewritten deal that just filled it in, right? Mm-hmm. And almost none of them would willing to choose to speak for their communities. But as rabbis, we love to do, right? But either
this is on me.
Right, yeah. Either the community was too split, or they just weren't speaking about it, or they would say, it's not. So a lot of them are speaking. This is what I think we should do. This is what I think should happen. The overwhelming. This is the thing that I saw the shift, and I think is interesting.
You're saying this is based on letters, not just the CCAR yearbook or whatever. But
right. Now these are the letters.
Letters from rabbis writing.
Rabbis writing, and this is Reform Rabbi asking all of his Reform colleagues, essentially, because at the time he has the title of like the corresponding secretary. So it's his role in the conference to write to people, not
but
only
this is
about
already 1926.
It's already 1926.
Okay.
And so they're asking, what do you think about this?
I think if I remember correctly, by 1926, from Marnie Davis's book, things had changed. 25, 26, things had changed on the federal legislative level. Like this is, people already started to realize we can't do these things as instituted in 1920. Like things have.
And that's exactly what these rabbis
it's sort of a mix between legislation and reality.
Because the reality is they can't enforce it. People are drinking, right?
Also, there is something about labor, right? It's one thing to want to enforce these things, but you only have so much federal labor at your disposal.
That too.
Yeah.
So the rabbis then become, in 1926, when you think back to where are they in 1914 and where are they 12 years later, right?
Vastly different. I mean, it's worlds apart.
They're worried about what are the ethics, what's the morality here, what's public perception look like. In 1926,
I was going to say, they went through so many changes. Between 1914 and 1920, think about it. You went through the Great War. The Great War.
Dry.
You had a global pandemic, which, global pandemics are big. You had women being able to vote in this country for the first time ever, and then also forbidding the alcohol. That is,
radical,
any one of those would have been enough, but all of those,
all insanely paradigm shifting of the country. And what the rabbis now, the Reform rabbis in 1926, they're more worried about the fact that we're undermining the law. You have a law in place, and it's not being enforced. They're not as concerned about public Jewish perception at this point. And it's not because anti-Semitism has gone anywhere. If anything, it's only gotten worse from 1920 to 1926.
Thank you, Kyrie. 1926. 1926. I'm sorry. Not 2026. I'm sorry.
Right?
Wrong century. Right 20s, right anti-Semitism.
Right. Same tropes.
Just get recycled.
So it's just wild to me that's that big shift. They really are caring about, like, this is bad for the Jews. And then the Reform rabbis of 1926 are saying, this is bad for America. It's not good for society. It's not good for democracy. And it doesn't look great for the Jews either, but they're not so worried about it anymore.
But it's also happening.
It's
happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that they just...
Wait, is this a separate set of letters or correspondence? Like, what's going on?
So 1926, these are... So we talked about the CCAR journals, which is all like business meetings.
This is now 1926 CCAR journals.
This is now the Rabbi Lazarin, this is all private correspondences, letters. So he's sending out the survey, and people are either filling it out, and some of them are writing their essays back to him. So it's an interesting thing. There's this big shift.
Because rabbis are known for being very small in words.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So now that I've done the intro, now we can jump into that.
What else have you found?
That's the majority of it.
And really, after that, no one cares, or at least nothing that's really recorded.
Very few things are recorded in the CCAR journals. This is the last correspondence. This Rabbi Lazaron. I don't want to say it just fizzles out, but like you said, it kind of does.
So there's a lot of energy and attention early 1920s, and then this new piece in 1926, but really that's kind of it.
It's kind of it. And I think what's interesting about these journals and it really does do a good job of highlighting like what are the issues they're worried about, right? Like what are the conversations they're having?
Such as?
Well, during is prohibition. Yeah. Some of the other things they're talking about too of suffrage. They're also talking about the war. They're talking about all the they have some
war, a global pandemic in the 20s.
Interesting. I did this
a global pandemic in the 20s.
I did this research a few years ago, well before COVID hit the U.S. And so if they're talking about a global pandemic, which I'm sure they were, I just didn't register to be like, oh, that's an interesting thing. Like it wasn't
like pandemic. What's a global pandemic?
Pandemic wasn't in my like glossary. It wasn't in my like, oh, let's go keyword search that.
Yeah.
So they largely after 1926, it seems to. I don't want to say that they don't think about it or talk about it anymore.
But at least in these records, it really does fizzle away.
It just fizzles out.
Yeah.
It's not that the problem goes away necessarily. It's just that
there's less attention.
It's not that.
I mean, I kind of get that sense. I would more than love to have Professor Marnie Davis back on the show, but that was also my sense from her Jews and Booze book, which is there's an attention early 20s, around 1926, and then then we have the 21st Amendment, which is more than a half decade later that we have that. So, for whatever, maybe they were just you needed by the late 1920s, maybe you just don't have the energy for it, but you don't have enough political motivation to repeal it, and finally by the early 30s, then you have motivation.
And there's the live reality too of like, okay, like
why bother?
Why are we talking about this? Like, if I'm gonna go to Shabbat dinner and I'm gonna have a couple glasses of wine, like, and no one asked where did you get it, even if I know which speakeasy, like, if people who were they were drinking all the way through. Right. Yeah. Now the rabbi, they care about a big conversation that they care about, particularly in these Lazaron letters and in the proceedings of the CCAR business meetings. They are also talking about of like freedom of religion, freedom of like the U.S. government.
Rabbi Zachary, you have mentioned various literature you've researched that clearly no one else has had a sustained research around, whether the journals, the yearbooks, these correspondences, letters around this topic of reform responses to prohibition, which is already phenomenal and fascinating. I'm so excited we could share this here. What has there been anything that really stood out to you, sort of on a broad level? Any specific correspondences? Anything stood out to you?
So I find when you go and read those responsa, so both the Rappaport responsa and the Louis Ginsburg responsa.
But Rabbi Ginsburg was specifically writing from a conservative standpoint,
right?
Versus Rabbi.
So Rappaport. It's not the reform, but it's I would call the liberal American rabbinate.
Because I know one of the key pieces, even though I haven't personally read it, but one of the key pieces he writes on is the Magen Avraham, Rabbi Avraham Gominer, and sort of permitting in some sort of fashion grape juice.
Right.
That was like a linchpin of his argument.
Correct.
Yeah.
So they come to the same conclusions at going in different directions, which I think is very interesting.
So this is a helpful contrast.
Sure.
So how does Rabbi Rappaport write?
So they both work within, they're writing responses. So they're both within the legal codes. They're both working halakhically.
Yeah.
And I wish I brought my research, but they take different
directions,
They take
approaches?
different like source texts, and come to different. So Rabbi Ginsburg is really looking at Shulchan Aruch and the Torah, which makes sense. He's a conservative rabbi. The Reform Responsa is based in there's some Psalms, there's some Talmudic texts and things.
But Shulchan Aruch and the Torah's Arba Turim are not as prime. Has much of a stake of primacy.
Right. They're legal codes. They're
Right,
later. They're later
and
writings.
who knows, maybe some of the listenership here don't know so much about reform, or certainly not 1920s Reform Responsa. What would they find as valuable text to marshal towards their argument?
Right. So any responsa literature it's a code. It has to work within the halakhic system. But a 1920s Reform rabbi working within a halakhic system in which they I wouldn't say reject, but don't hold as authoritative. It's like fascinating loop. It's like you're jumping through hoops almost. But it's very clear that the tradition is speaking for itself. It's not saying this is what we want and let's make it work.
Yeah.
It's a genuine, authentic reading. And it's
But
just,
Psalms, I would say it sounds like conservative or Orthodox wouldn't necessarily resort to those texts, so it's fascinating.
right. It said something about how King David talked about wine gladdening one's heart.
Right, so that's from Psalms 104.
Right.
Yain Samach Levav Anosh, right? You have wine that gladdens the man's heart. So that would be somewhere in chapter 104.
So I can't
It'll
say
be
that that's
there.
not found in.
Right.
I can't. So of all of Rabbi Ginsburg. So one of the interesting things about him, this is a fascinating one.
So, by the way, Rabbi Ginsburg response, I have not read. I've heard it's incredibly voluminous.
It's wonderful.
And who knows, it could be a topic of a future whole separate episode.
For a rabbi smarter than I, because of the 100 or so responsa that he writes, one of the things that's really fascinating is that Louis Ginsburg writes in English, all but 2 or 3 of his responsa. And he's from Lithuania, right? And is really steeped in Hebrew. It's odd that
English is not his first language.
it's not even a second or third language. And
One of those, yeah.
And this is one of the 2 that he writes in Hebrew.
Oh.
It's then later translated.
Later translated in the American Yearbook.
Exactly.
Jewish
That's
Yearbook.
where that's the version I've read. So I imagine if you read it in the Hebrew, something's always a little lost.
I have read an article. There are some slight differences, but yeah.
Right. So that I think that's an interesting thing. Your question was what were some of the things that really kind of popped out.
Absolutely.
I think it's fascinating that they're talking about this 6 years before
The Volstead Act actually is
passed.
Yeah.
Right, because Prohibition.
But there's a momentum.
There's momentum.
There's clearly national momentum.
And there's a whole year in between the passing of the 18th Amendment and the passing of the Volstead Act. There's a
It was a whole year. Okay.
but 6 years prior, and I have to go back and look. I'm not sure if they're even talking about the word prohibition, but they're talking about what do we Reform American rabbis think about this.
Also, before it gets passed on a national level, before we get to even the 18th Amendment or Volstead Act, many states have already passed prohibition or temperance stuff by that already by 1910. So there is clearly a momentum building up.
And in this time period, the Reformed Jewish world is very assimilist. We are assimilating quickly, purposefully, the big, like you mentioned before, the big pushes in church and state are Protestant. Reform Judaism is taking on a lot of Protestant isms.
Really?
Right? The decorum of services, the pews, the way in which people are praying and when and with the flows of life. And so I find it fascinating that in 1914, the rabbis are entirely consumed by what does this look like for the rabbis, right? Are we going to tarnish our names?
Okay.
And they're also concerned about what does this look like for our people, right? And they take on this value system saying we care about this moderate lifestyle. We think it's the right way to go. And Judaism says there's no issue with this. Like, I kind of love the way you started this episode about like.
Thank you.
But truly though, like, let's look at the Jewish people as an example of what does it look like to ethically.
It's not me. I'm just mentioning what Rabbi Weiss said that was mentioned by Professor Marty Davis in her Jews and Booze book. I mean, he says that in the late 19th century. Jews have a more comfortable relationship with drinking. It's not as adversarial as Christians have it, whether in Poland, whether in Caribbean, whether in late 19th, early 20th century America. It's not like the Protestants have it. It's, look, drinking is part of life. How do we embrace it and otherwise not only embrace drinking but use it to enhance our lives, but not also to be enslaved by it? So
well, I think to your good point though, part of that answer, and I don't have an answer either, but it's part of life. But it's also part of
being Jewish.
It's part of being Jewish, right?
The questions are better than the answers.
But it's all, you talked about it, right? You drink at your wedding. You drink at your, people. There's a you drink at your bris.
Right.
The moment
you're 8 days old.
8 days old. You have your first drink. Yeah. It's part of the life cycle, not just part of the life too.
Rabbi Zachary Goodman, this has been fantastic, fascinating, insightful. You've done research no one else has done. Is there anything you would like to promote?
There's a lot of wonderful congregations out there in the world, and so if find yourself a Jewish community, it's a good way to live.
Awesome.
Any one of them, they're all good.
Speaking of living in life, with that, Rabbi Goodman, l'chaim.